Hey guys, welcome to today's video. We are actually going to start a new topic or unit if we were in normal class and not remote learning. And this is going to be our political participation unit. So basically this to me is like the core of government, right? This is how you as a citizen, when you turn 18, can get involved, how the process works. To me, this is the most relevant stuff that I think our class has to offer. So the very first topic that we are going to be talking about is political socialization and ideology. So what the heck does that mean? So basically the questions that we're asking ourselves with these are: what influences how we view politics? How do we learn how to vote? And then specifically, what do we learn in terms of voting, in terms of how we vote? What ideas do we come to learn about politics? So these are the two questions that we're going to be focusing on today. The first thing that you need to do is write down our definition of political socialization on your note sheet from Google Classroom. So political socialization, just as a broad definition, is the process through which an individual acquires their particular political orientation and values. So breaking this down a little bit, guys, socialization is basically how we learn norms and how to be and act in society. So political socialization then is basically just how we learn about government and how we learn about what we believe in terms of politics, right? So there are a couple of trends that influence how we are socialized politically. And the very first is family. This is the most important form of political socialization. And this should not be surprising because our families are who we spend the most time with at an early age. We are surrounded by individuals, so it makes sense that their values and their beliefs and their political orientations rub off, on us in some way, shape, or form, right? And to the point where our political leanings often mirror our parents' leanings. There is a significant trend of, if your family is Republican, you are more likely to grow up to be a Republican or a conservative, and then vice versa with Democrats. And as I mentioned, this is our number one form of political socialization. The other methods that we are going to be talking about are secondary to this one, simply because they don't impact us as young or as often as our family does, or as frequently, I should say. Another way that we are politically socialized is religion. And sometimes when we think about government, right, we don't think about the value part of it, right? We think about policies, but actually government involves a lot of values and the way we view the world in terms of morals, for example. So religion does play a role in how we view politics, particularly depending on what religion we believe in, if we believe in any. So just some examples of some trends. Catholic families tend to be more liberal economically and conservative socially. And we'll talk about what those two terms mean, conservative versus liberal, in this video. But that's just a trend we see in terms of Catholic families. Protestant families tend to be conservative economically and socially. And Jewish families tend to be liberal economically and socially. So based on the religions and their values, we do see them producing patterns in how people come to view politics and then eventually how they vote. Another way we are socialized politically is by our gender. Men and women vote differently on average. It's not a huge gap, but there is a gap in terms of how they vote. Men are increasingly Republican since the 1960s, leaning toward that conservative side of the spectrum. And women identify more with the Democratic Party, which, as you can see, these are opposing political parties that we have in our country. And this reflects the differences between men and women. As we will see, the Republican or Conservative Party tends to focus on tradition and smaller government, I should say, whereas the Democratic Party tends to be a little bit more progressive, a little bit more government providing things to the people, where women haven't had opportunities and as many civil rights in the past. So women tend to like the equality that tends to come with the liberal ideology or the Democratic Party. This is just some data, excuse me, guys, on the 2016 election. So as you can see, the fact that gender socializes us was, I should say, in effect during the 2016 election. Males were more likely to vote for Donald Trump versus females who were more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. Schooling also socializes us. Think about it, right? Government is required in every state for high school. Why? Well, we are a democratic society. We want people to become good democratic citizens. This is how you learn about government and the process. And the point is really to teach you what you believe in and how you can then participate in government. So it is a form of socialization, the fact that you were sitting in my room and listening to this video now. We do see some trends when it comes to schooling. For example, people with a bachelor's degree, which is a 4-year college degree, tend to lean more conservative. And then the more education someone has, so beyond a bachelor's degree, whether that's a master's or a PhD even, that has a liberalizing effect. So bachelor's degree tends to be more conservative, more Republican leaning, and more education tends to have that liberalizing effect, meaning they lean more towards the Democratic Party. And part of this is because there is an exposure on campuses of college to more diverse viewpoints. So as you can see here, this is just reflecting that data. One thing to note is that high school or less often votes Republican and conservatively as well. So in 2016, high school or less, people were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Some college, again, you see that shifting to the conservative side or Donald Trump. And then college and post-grad, you start seeing that shift to the liberal side of the ideology. Finally, we have the mass media in terms of how we are socialized politically. One thing that we are seeing trend-wise is that there is a generation gap in TV news viewing, right? I mean, I would be very surprised, well, maybe not in our current situation, but on a normal day, right, where we're not in quarantine, there's probably a big difference between the ages that watch TV and those that don't, right? Your older generations tend to watch TV, whereas my generation, your generation, we tend to get our information from social media and things like that. But this is where we hear a lot of our information on politics and what we come to believe. So one thing to know, guys, is that bias is in the media, no matter what you listen to, where you get your information from. The news station that you watch or that is on TV as you grow up, again, going back to family, will affect the way you think. So Fox, for example, is a predominantly conservative news station, whereas CNN is predominantly liberal or Democratic leaning. So this has some implications in terms of how you view politics and what's going on in society. So the question is, once we are socialized, what exactly are we socialized to believe, right? I threw around those words, liberal and conservative, quite a bit. And those are political ideologies. These are the foundations, the beliefs about government. So to define political ideology, consistent set of political beliefs about what goals the government should pursue. Right? So what should the government do for people? How should the government regulate business? These, as we will talk about here in a second, are different from political parties, but political ideologies are based on self-identification. There is no specific, registration that you have to complete. This is just you describing your own choice as either a liberal or a conservative. And as I mentioned, political ideology is not the same as a political party. Your ideology will often guide you to a political party. So I've kind of used this or talked about this in this video. Conservatives tend to be more in line with the Republican Party versus liberals tend to be more in line with the Democratic Party. Right? And minor parties, third parties, are often an option. And we will see this next week when I have you guys take a look at political parties. Now, I wanted to talk about just what it means to be a liberal versus a conservative. So, what you guys see in front of you is the political ideology spectrum. So, on the left here, we have communism, socialism, and liberalism. Right? Moderates are those who kind of could fall either way. They're more in the middle. And then on the right, when we say right leaning, we're talking about conservatism, libertarianism, and fascism. So the further you go on the spectrum, the more extreme, quote unquote, it becomes. So I'm going to start at our extremes, and I'm going to talk about communism first. This is the farthest left that is on our political spectrum. Right? When we think of communism, we think of China, we think of Russia, we think of the Soviet Union from our history classes. But this is where the government is in control of everything. There is a very, very, very large government, right? And the goal is complete equality, a classless society. Oftentimes, communism does not have the best quality of life. It's often primarily because you have to force equality. Equality doesn't happen naturally. So oftentimes there is a dictatorship when it comes to communism. Now, on the right side, the furthest right that you can go, you have fascism. Fascism is very authoritarian. Again, often a dictatorship. So think Mussolini, Hitler. It is opposed to communism. There are a lot of capitalist elements. Fascism embraces the inequality. And oftentimes these types of systems are militaristic, like I said, authoritarian. Moving in a little bit, let's do a little bit less extremes. So on the left, we have socialism. Socialism is an ideology that pushes for social and economic equality. Socialism wants a big government to enforce social and economic equality. Not as big as communism, but it is still a thought of socialism that in order to make sure that that equality happens, the government needs to get involved pretty heavily. So socialist ideas that you guys may have heard of would be things like free healthcare for all. If you guys remember hearing Bernie Sanders talking about that, creating a living wage, so raising minimum wage to something like $15, that's a socialist idea. Then on the right side, a little bit less extreme than fascism, is libertarianism. And this, instead of social and economic equality, libertarianism focuses on social and economic freedom with a small government. Basically, the smaller the government, the better. To libertarians, the only thing that the government should do would be to protect the rights of citizens. Otherwise, there should be no involvement by the government at all. If any of you are familiar with the show Parks and Rec, which if you haven't watched it, you should watch it now because you are in quarantine. This is your Ron Swanson of the political ideology spectrum. So the next two are probably the most common, actually I should say they are the most common political ideologies. So let's talk about liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism talks about wanting economic equality among people, but social freedom. So, for example, this would be expanding welfare programs to aid the poor. That would be the economic equality piece, taxing the wealthy, making sure that everyone has equal opportunity when it comes to socioeconomic status. But they also are in favor of social freedom. So your liberal ideology is going to be, think about things like your pro-choice movement when it comes to abortion, right? A woman's right to choose. Now, conservatives, on the other hand, want the government to protect social traditions, but not to interfere with the economy. So these are your modern day Republicans, and they believe that the government should not regulate businesses. The government should not provide as much aid to the poor, for example, because that is considered government waste. So if you've ever heard of laissez-faire, hands off, that is more conservatism. So let's do a little bit more digging into liberalism versus conservatism and what the two parties, whether that's Democratic or Republican, tend to believe. So liberals tend to believe in these ideas here. As I said, these are your more economic equality and social freedom. Government action is needed to achieve equal opportunity and equality for all. So again, that idea that human beings, we don't naturally lean toward equality. So the government has to step in to kind of push us in that direction. Liberals tend to also believe that it's the responsibility of the government to alleviate social ills or problems and to protect civil liberties and individual and human rights. So again, the government needs to step in, a little bit of a bigger role here to make sure that everyone is equal. The role of the government should be to guarantee that no one is in need, again, going back to that economic equality, and there is a need for the government to solve problems. So we'll see this, in terms of, like I said before, those welfare programs. Now, conservatives tend to believe in personal responsibility, limited government, free markets, individual liberty, traditional values, and a strong national defense. So conservatives are your group that tend to push for increasing the defense budget, whereas liberals tend to believe that that's not necessarily a good way to spend government money, right? We should focus on creating a little bit more equality, making sure no one is in need. Conservatives also tend to believe that the role of the government should be to provide people with freedom to pursue their own goals, not to guarantee that no one's in need, but to allow anyone to pursue what they see fit, kind of that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness characteristic. And conservatives also tend to believe in empowering the individual to solve problems. Again, as you can see, there's very little government regulation on the conservative side of things versus the liberal side of things. So that wraps up the differences between the ideologies as well as how we are socialized to acquire our ideologies. So I have a summary question that you guys need to answer on your sheet, and that is, how have you personally been socialized politically? So think about those 5 different things that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. What have you been taught to think about politics? Who or what taught you? Basically, what has had the biggest influence on your beliefs about government? What have you been taught to think about politics? Have you been taught to participate or not? Do you know if you consider yourself a liberal or a conservative or something even more on the extreme sides of that spectrum? So go ahead and make sure to answer that question on your sheet in Google Classroom and turn in when finished. If you guys have any questions, make sure to stop by during office hours, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.